Morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar around 3 quick wins for remote enterprise device management. My name is Heinrich Pelser. I'm part of the pre-sales team here at PowerON Platforms. And today's session is all around some advice, some help, some understanding around some of the, desktop management pieces that IT teams are having to deal with, right? So to sort of set the scene for today, we'll be looking at Endpoint Manager, what it is and how it works, and maybe how do you adopt it. Because I think in obviously a lot of people's minds, something like Endpoint Manager is this weird amalgamation of all sorts of tools. But what is it really? What does it actually look like as well, right? And how do you go about adopting it maybe as well, right? We'll be then looking at some easy wins for update deployment, something we've seen quite a lot of clients actually not make use of, strangely. And some easy areas that I think can have some immediate impact, just around some ticks and trips, more than anything else, right? And towards the tail end of that, today's session is around things like toast notification. So it's this Windows 10 thing. It brings something up on your screen when you want it to. You can customize it. You can push this through your relevant endpoint manager fronts, your SCCMs, or whatever you need to do as well, right? So I wanted to start today's conversation around, obviously to the left-hand side of the screen, endpoint manager, what it is, and how do you maybe start adopting it, and what does it mean in the real world, and so on and so on as well, right? So to help answer that question, what I kind of wanted to do is maybe just bring up the Microsoft documentation actually. So if you type into Google Endpoint Manager or Microsoft Endpoint Manager, you'll land on the page in front of you, and this is the sort of topology, the breakdown of what it means in the Microsoft world, right? So Microsoft Endpoint Manager is this amalgamation of tools, so many things to make this one platform happen, right? And it's all stuff that we're used to, right? So we're talking about SCCM or Configuration Manager, whichever your preference is as part of that. We've then got Intune in the mix. And then there's lots of bits you can start to add on as part of this, right? Because there's no Intune without things like Azure AD. And there's no Azure AD without things like conditional access and MFA and device management and SaaS and PaaS and all this stuff that we keep getting thrown at us as well, right? But the basic point of this, the basic principle of this entire sort of mock-up and this collection of sort of utilities that you see in front of you is to give IT teams, IT departments, as many tools as possible to make their lives as easy as possible. With just the sort of natural way pre-COVID, right? Someone had to say it today, the word COVID, but we saw this real shift into modern working and modern management and flexible working and all these other stuff that we started having to sort of take care of as IT teams, right? So in Microsoft's eyes, you could argue to their dismay or to their pleasure, to some extent, they realized that actually, what, a sort of culmination of these tools might make more sense for an enterprise market. Going Intune only does present some really, interesting sort of challenges. Maybe it doesn't fit for purpose for everyone. So this Endpoint Manager platform was born out of this idea, right? So the idea is you don't have to go from one to the other in terms of on-premise to the cloud. You can manage anything from anywhere. It doesn't really matter. And I'll kind of dive into what that looks like in a real-world example a little bit later on as well, right? But we sort of shift towards Intune-only management, right? And what that really meant. Now, to kind of kick things off today, I wanted to look at a sort of Intune-only approach. What does that mean? How does it work? What are some of the pros and what are some of the cons? And these pros and cons aren't a biased look. This is feedback that we as PowerON have taken from existing clients in terms of learning. We offer a managed service purely based on Intune, for example, as well, right? So this isn't a sort of bad mouthing of Intune. This is just what is the real experience? What are some of the things to think about? And this massively differs from organization to organization, right? So in terms of some of the pros, it's super scalable, right? It's perfect if you are a new organization or a young organization or an organization that is cloud focused. This does meet every tick box in the argument for a cloud strategy around desktop management. And if you need a fairly simple, scalable, sort of tool set, Intune's definitely the sort of right tool for the job, right? It's initially, in terms of its initial inception, although it did have loose ties into Windows 7, was made as an MDM platform for mobile phones, right? So you had Windows Mobile. Some of the few diehards still to this day use things like Windows Mobile, but a lot of it is now centered around things like Android and iOS management, so Apple iOS. devices, right? Um, it's really easy to use. I'll show you guys in a moment later on some of the easy buttons, and it's fairly straightforward to configure and set stuff up and do things on it. I had one client who the reason he chose the reason he chose Intune was because, in his words, complexity was the enemy within his organization. So he needed to look at a really simple management tool set that he can give to his teams to go ahead and use and to manage his Windows 10 estate, including things like phones and so on, right? It's really good for flat topologies. So if you're not really massively concerned about things like bandwidth and so on, it's fairly straightforward. And obviously, off the tail end of that, because it's a SaaS service, it's a Microsoft service, the sort of scale factor goes up exponentially. So you don't have to kind of build this for scale. You can start at 100 and go to 100,000 overnight. I suppose it's one of the beauties of public cloud computing as well, right? So as a tool, in terms of simplicity, ease of use, and what it does for IT, there's some really good pros, right? Now it comes down to some of the cons, and we've seen a lot of this more based around, for example, at the moment, in my experience anyway, certain aspects of the private sector, especially where things like regulatory compliance is a big deal, where sort of some of the security teams as well are heavily influenced in terms of the overall device security, of which patching is a part of. Granular management and distribution of data is key for them or for those organizations, right? So to be able to be specific about content, where it lives, how it gets to the device, and so on beyond the internet is something that Intune doesn't do a great job of, right? Um, in terms of device provisioning, some organizations for regulatory needs, for simple hardware viability in terms of the device may not even support it, depending on the device, of course, as well as then anything they need to do from an internal perspective. Things like traditional build cycles is obviously a thing of the past. You'll be pushed more towards the Windows Autopilot side of the fence. And I suppose in some respects, it's quite a rational position to have. If you're already on Windows 10, it makes little to no sense to remove Windows 10 to put Windows 10 back on as part of a build process. And Intune and Configuration Manager, does a good job at, being able to cater for both scenarios as part of that, right? Windows as a service is something we've seen lots of clients struggle with around things like, again, control, granularity, customizations, and so on. So leveraging the Intune model just applies what's there from a Microsoft stance. You have to do a lot of the due diligence and the sort of implementation, testing, development, and so on from an Intune side prior to upgrading Windows as a service, or as being as part of that upgrade motion anyway. So what I mean by that specifically is the granularity of that particular deployment motion can be relatively intrusive. It's difficult to kind of be very exact because you're just applying what Microsoft have made available through Windows Update for Business, for example, as well as in the feature update side of things. So it is definitely something to consider. And as part of that, there's lots of change, as you would guess. The same is true on Configuration Manager as it would be with most tools, but because of where it sits, and it's quite an organic type product, sort of the granular management of everything can be a little bit tough at times, especially with the sort of constant rate of changes. And you can start to see fairly unhappy users, especially when you have large software deliveries and so on coming down as well. It can take its time. It can flood a VPN pipe or a proxy pipe if it's not done properly. And it's very difficult to pre-stage content because you're heavily reliant on your sort of direct connection to the cloud. So if we look at a real world example of where something like Endpoint Manager fits into it, right? Lots of bits and pieces we're trying to, basically what that organizations are asking for are kind of built around these sort of usual needs, right? So these are some of the functional capabilities that lots of organizations crave, and we'll start to see how this builds out into an endpoint manager environment as well, right? So we're talking about things like granular access based control. So I have a team of people that are just responsible for patching or reporting or for compliance and so on, right? Being able to carefully segregate those roles is something that Endpoint Manager does, very, very well. We need to look at things like hardware and software inventory, OS imaging and provisioning, all right? Analytics as part of that, all right? Being able to tell what's compatible, device analytics around things like, performance is going to be key. The management of third-party patching. Microsoft does a very good job at patching Microsoft Windows 10 and Office 365 and so on. Maybe not so good for anything else, you have to the side of that, right? So real good integration as part of that is going to be key. In conjunction with that, you have things like the actual distribution of everything, right? Script and PowerShell deployments and all these types of things, IT teams are asking for. Mobile device management, both corporate and BYOD, and then more importantly, things like internet-based management as well, right? So this is something that everyone's craving for. And then the big thing as well is around things like compliance reporting. You are going to have to start looking at getting a detailed feel of what your devices are doing, not just from a performance perspective, but from a regulatory perspective as well, maybe. So you might be going towards things like Cyber Essentials or an ISO accreditation, making sure that your device can step in line with all of the tick boxes you need to start adhering to. It's obviously going to be key as part of that as well, right? So if we look at Endpoint Manager from a top-down perspective in terms of, how it is actually built out in the real world, and some bits and pieces to start thinking about from an organizational perspective for you guys, is you have Endpoint Manager at its core, or SCCM if you prefer, right? Usually we see this kind of built out and extended to meet different business needs, right? So again, this is a high-level architecture that you might be used to. It can extend to things like a VPN gateway, to start managing remote locations, right? This could be people, these could be offices, right? And we'll now start to look at things like, okay, as part of that, what do we need to start thinking about? Devices. What type of devices? iOS devices, Android devices, laptops, desktops, BYOD. IT have got a whole range of stuff that they constantly need to be aware of and supply services to as well, right? Within your local or remote office, for example, if you're going to try and keep central control, you might have distribution points or peer-to-peer caching or branch cache, whichever you prefer, right? To start reducing that workload from an endpoint manager perspective. Traffic then flows through, for example, your VPN gateway or whatever it might be, over into the local management side, with then roaming devices being managed either through things like a cloud management gateway or Intune itself, and we'll have a look at what that means in a moment as well. So then you start managing office locations or remote locations, whatever it might be. This could be things at home or far away, all from a central point, right? So Endpoint Manager does its best to tie all of those technology streams together. So to have a single pane of glass. Again, apologies for saying that, but someone had to. You would then start to maybe look to build that out in terms of advanced reporting. You can do that through desktop analytics or endpoint analytics, all feeding into things like Power BI or whatever it might be, with a view then of keeping central control, right, in order to supply end users with what they want, right? So you could have either regional teams or local teams to that, and making sure that you supply things like image modifications, collection management, application updates, patching control, all of those bits and pieces to end users on the other side of that fence, right? But your architecture from an endpoint manager perspective stays very central a lot of the time. Okay, you can look to obviously expand that, and that's usually expanded through a couple of ways. You could have a cloud management gateway be part of that conversation, so that's something that ties into configuration manager heavily to start accessing and providing services to devices outside of your network. Windows 10 devices are a massive conversation piece at the moment around making sure that people are at home. How do I patch them? How do I see their compliance? All that type of stuff. A cloud management gateway usually is part of the answer for that, right? Unless you have a co-management situation where you can start providing and selecting services from Intune. Okay, so then I'll show you guys in a moment as well what that looks like from a endpoint manager perspective as well, right? But the point is you want to make sure you keep some levels of central control with the view of then distributing those services you provide as IT out to the wider organization, wherever that might be, both regional as well as then in and around, their homes, for example. Okay. If we're starting to look at how do we start adopting this, right? I think this is one of the biggest things I get asked quite a lot. As with anything, you start small, right? You need to look at the executive side of things, strategies and goals. Okay, we have people working from home. We have people working remotely. We're looking to do an acquisition. We've got new offices opening in China and in Australia and in South Africa, wherever it might be, right? Start by defining what you're trying to achieve from an IT perspective, whether that's centralized management, whether that's more of an open feel in terms of BYOD, where's the business going, what do you need to take care of from a compliance and regulatory perspective, and then help build that picture for the business with executive sponsorship to help drive change, right? Start understanding as IT departments, what you need to do in terms of what are the processes and activities we need to take care of to supply people at home with email, with encryption, with Office 365, with software, with updates, with Windows as a service, whatever it might be, right? And then start to look towards, potential services like smart teaming. PowerON does this, for a living. You could start to look to maybe integrate some of your services and go, okay, I don't want to take care of patching anymore. I'll give that to someone else. Actually, we don't need to take care of Windows as a service anymore. We'll give that to someone else. We just want to make sure we look after things like compliance, and the software side of things will make something else someone else's problem, either through outsourcing or whatever the case might be, right? So you start to define your processes and your activities quite early on, so you understand very early on whether there's going to be a shortfall, whether there's going to be an issue, where there's going to be a capability gap or a sort of operational gap you need to mitigate, and plump with a view then of going towards the relevant technology that you want to use. Lots of organizations find actually something like Configuration Manager and a Cloud Management Gateway meets all its needs. They have a third-party tool that looks after mobile devices, or actually the third-party tool is quite expensive. We've purchased the M&S, why don't we go towards Intune? Why don't we go towards Endpoint Manager? And so on and so on, right? So you can start to leverage your existing investments to start meeting some of those needs. Why pay for something if you've already owned it? All right, that goes for VPNs, that goes for antivirus, that goes for MDM solutions, it goes for lots of stuff, right? If you already own the licensing to leverage it in the cloud, why not use that? What's the need? Why are you staying with, a third-party product, right? Look to leverage your existing investments in Microsoft technology stacks as well, right? Roles and responsibilities need to be defined and agreed as well, right? Things like, in terms of active day-to-day coverage, what are the processes we need to look at? All right, how do we start tangibly putting in a process to onboard new users? What is the autopilot process? What is the process for us to get a new user onboarded that may never come into the office anymore, right? Let's start to look at how we start to operate around those nuances and those services and leverage something like Endpoint Manager to help us get there, right? Endpoint Manager is effectively the vehicle. You build your processes and strategies into that, right? And then you can start to look at the local adoption of operational, in this instance is referred to as opcos, but regional offices, regional users. Do you start small? Do you start with London first and then start to build out? And as with anything, you look to sort of start using a phased approach wherever possible, right? With a view then of obviously driving towards modern, right? Or a more modern management approach. So using this particular framework to start adopting some of those services is a logical onboarding process to get to a much more of an open, holistic sort of device type management side of things as well, right? So some of the simple tips and tricks as part of today's webinar is focused around a couple of things mainly. I'm happy to show you guys some of the nuances around things like patching. I know that's been something that we get asked about a lot, specifically if you already are part of an endpoint manager type environment, and then towards the tail end of that, some customizations and custom stuff you can do around things like toast notifications, which might be a really nice way to reach out to existing users through a CMG, through SCCM. It runs off PowerShell basically, as well as then, making sure that those devices out there are patched and how they patched and so on and so on. So you can do some really easy stuff to start mitigating and managing some of those basic processes that IT has to cater for. So here in front of you, you see Configuration Manager at the moment, right? So this is SCCM. This is something that lots and lots of people will be used to on this call. And I wanted to quickly focus in around the co-management side of things, right? To start looking at, as part of that Endpoint Manager chat we had just a moment ago, what it really looks like in the real world. So one of the big reasons you want to go towards something like Endpoint Manager is to start splitting down and starts to distribute some of those workloads, right? So if we go to the workloads tab here, you'll see that actually I have SCCM, I have Intune. I'd like them to work together. We won't dive too deeply into things like tenant attach and so on at the moment. I just wanted to plant some early seeds in the head around, okay, my compliancy policies at the moment they might live with Configuration Manager or SCCM. I would like to shift those towards Intune. And it is literally as easy as a drag and drop type exercise, right? Actually, my device configuration, I like Configuration Manager to do that. Currently we use Intune for that. Client apps, click to run apps, and so on, can all be sort of staged and managed by different sort of sets of products as well, right? So actually going towards something like an endpoint manager, quote unquote, type approach is fairly straightforward, provided you have co-management configured at the time as well, right? And then towards the tail end here, you'll see that we have a CMG, we have a cloud management gateway as part of this. This is a demo lab. to start meeting some of those crucial services we need to do, specifically around things like patching and keeping things up to date and so on as well, right? Um, so if we take a quick look at some of the obvious things that IT teams can start doing from a tips perspective, automatic deployment rules, right? So we have several, as you probably would guess, but this is really something that IT teams need to start thinking about, especially if you have to patch. So in this scenario, we have a CMG, we have it configured, we have clients on the other end. Now, how do we get them patched? All right, what do we need to start thinking about? How easy is that just to do if you're either new or whatever the case might be to something like Endpoint Manager as well, right? So you would start to look to use something like a automatic deployment rule. Now, an automatic deployment rule, as I'll take you through here, is a very easy, straightforward way of getting updates out on schedule to devices, right? But there's one important tip towards the tail end of this. So we'll call this particular Windows 10 ADR Windows 10 updates. All right, and we'll give it a description. All right, and we'll complete this to a target collection. So a collection is obviously a logical collection of devices. In this instance, we're just going to pick Luke's Windows 7-zip collection. You'd probably aim this at either a department or a region, whatever the case may be, right? We're going to create a new software update group as part of this, and we're not going to want the rule to run automatically, right? So the deployment settings, fairly straightforward. Making sure you only report in certain levels of information that you want to see as part of this. Software updates. So this is again where the automatic deployment rule starts coming into play. So what we're doing here is we're defining our criteria. So basically what we're saying is I'm going to select some products, and the products that I would like Windows updates for, surprise, surprise, you'll not be shocked to know that it will be Windows 10. And I've gone straight past it. Here we go. So I will go ahead and choose Windows 10 as part of this, right? And I want to make sure that the updates are superseded. I don't want any superseded updates. So I want no to be superseded. And then I'll click on preview and it'll show me the type of updates that is already cached, and you can see there's plenty of them, right? The likelihood is you'll be far more granular in terms of your search criteria, your sort of collection criteria as well, right? We'll keep going through the wizard. We want to make sure that this rule runs we'll run it on a schedule, we'll run it monthly, and we'll run it every day, once a month, all right? Or we'll do it on the last working day of the month. Great, so now we have the schedule and we know that it will sync and run and patch our devices accordingly. This is quite a useful tip as well, actually, is that if you have regional based devices and you have a compliancy rule that means you have to patch everyone at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning, right? You can use client local time, right? If obviously you use UTC, it will patch things UK time or from wherever you've set this particular server to run up from as well, right? So if you leverage the client local time, you can patch everyone in China, America, wherever at 8 o'clock local time. So it's a nice tip to have. We've seen a couple of clients run into a whoopsie daisy as part of that, where they patch things 9 or 10 hours out of sync as part of that as well, right? Software update time, we want to make that as soon as possible. Installation deadline will give people 7 days to push through this as well. User experience, we don't really care. We want to make sure that we hide everything. We don't want the users to see what's going on, if that's all right. We'll skip past the alerts bit because that's relevant to Ops Manager only, really, and then again the deployment package. Now, the deployment package, by definition, is we've told Configuration Manager to go and give us the software updates as part of our search criteria, put them all in a bag, and then put them somewhere for us to download and install. That's basically the process we've just run through, right? Now, here's a little tick box at the bottom that gets almost no love these days, all right? And it's quite an important tick box. As you can see there, this is saying that I don't need a deployment package because all I've done is I've defined a set of rules that I'm going to push out to my agents, my laptops, my desktops, to go ahead and either grab that from peers or the Microsoft Cloud directly. All right. So if I have people all across the world, anywhere in the world, provided they have an internet connection and they get my Intune, my SCCM policy, they'll go ahead and just download this straight from Microsoft.com, right? Or the Microsoft Cloud, updates.microsoft.com, whatever the URL is these days. So the beauty of this is it's not going to try and come back in through Azure and try and pull things from a distribution point. It doesn't have to, because effectively, if you have a CMG in place, and it's updating policy on your SCCM clients, the minute you push that policy to your clients as part of this particular workload you see in front of you, you say just these updates at this time, the SCCM agent on that device will just contact Microsoft.com and pull those updates down accordingly based on a schedule, right? So this really is the beauty of it. You don't have to configure things to talk back into your network the whole time. Lots of this resources already exist on the cloud. You know, why not maybe make use of them? Okay. So that is one part of it, and I think this is in itself quite a useful tip for organizations to start looking at, right? So by clicking just this little button, um, you go on from here and you can obviously go ahead and deploy things as needed as part of this. But as part of today's kind of little session anyway, I thought this was quite a useful thing to see to sort of show organizations, and it is something that we're seeing having a sort of real tangible positive impact, especially if you have clients out and about on a VPN trying to talk in when they don't have to, especially around things like updates, right? And then the beauty is if you have a CMG, the compliancy gets reported back in once those updates are obviously installed as well, okay? So let's quickly have a look at some of the toast notifications as well. So to kind of get back on to topic as well. So in terms of some of the toast notifications, as you guys will know, there is within Windows 10, it's something that we're seeing quite a lot. You can customize, obviously to your heart's content, the sort of toast notification as well, and then deploy these particular settings out with something like Configuration Manager as well, right? So a toast notification, as you guys know, would either appear here, it can also be flashed up on screen as well. So to kind of show you what I mean, all of this is very much possible with PowerShell. So I've just run a quick PowerShell script here to publish this toast notification, and fingers crossed it should pop up in a moment. And there we go. So the sort of point here is you can do this for a sort of number of use cases, right? So one of the biggest reasons that we're seeing organizations leverage this is you can either publish, so, you know, look, your computer's been on for 10, 15 days, there's a pending reboot, go ahead and please reboot it, for example, right? You can see here that I've put one of the director's faces on there, his peering eyes, which, you know, is enough to make anyone do anything you want them to go ahead and obviously just reboot their device, for example. But this can be translated into a whole range of things. You can ask people how they are, to either check into something. You can build in a form, for example. So, you know, we know you've been online for a while. It's past 10 o'clock. Are you all right? Is there a survey you want to fill in? Or actually, here's some anecdotal information. Or actually, we've noticed this. Or here's a new update. As part of the company thing, you can point people to obviously websites and so on. You can obviously customize these buttons to your heart's content. And effectively, by definition, it's a fairly straightforward process. I can obviously click, you know, restart now, and it'll go ahead and reboot my PC. There's a learn more button. Well, where's this come from? And I can obviously dismiss it. The likelihood is you're going to get rid of this button. But the point still remains that you can start to, you know, customize these things as well, right? And all of this is relevant through the sort of SCCM model around scripting and being able to deploy that out to people. And as I said, you can really, really go to town on this. We're seeing organizations use this for a huge, wide range of reasons. So getting this built into your SCCM infrastructure, even your endpoint infrastructure, you know, could be a real kind of benefit as well, right? And it's definitely something that organizations should start to look at. So just to tie things back up, a little bit of a bow as well. If we look at, you know, that whole endpoint manager picture again, beyond some of those anecdotal tips around the getting updates to go to Microsoft, as well as then the toast notifications, how all of this fits together is if we look at here quickly, so under again your CoManagement side of things, how all of this pumps into the endpoint manager thing from a, you know, management perspective as well. So if you look here, configure the upload, you'll see here that there's this tick box as you go about configuring your co-management settings is to upload the Endpoint Manager Admin Center as well, right? So this will then go ahead and push the relevant bits and pieces that you guys want to see into here. So this is the Endpoint Manager console, and within here you'll start to see your devices. So this means it's SCCM devices as well as Intune devices as well, right? And you'll see here Intune and co-manage and configuration managed devices and so on and so on. This is just a demo environment in this instance, but you can start to get some really, you know, clean clinical detail all from one place. Okay, so the idea here is we're taking Intune devices and SCCM devices, bringing them all together to start managing them from a central perspective. So you've got some easy bits very early on. That's a real value add to IT as part of that endpoint manager sort of setup. Is you can look at the hardware, the discovered apps, device compliance, and so on and so on, right? So within this one it's good, it's compliant with the inbuilt policy. There's a Windows 10 compliancy policy. You can drill into that even further. Anti-spyware is good and password complexity is fine, and so on and so on and so on. The firewall is on, blah, blah, blah. All of the cliche things, the usual things that we as IT care about is all taken care of. It's all done. It's all catered for as well, right? So once you start to sort of move towards that transitional piece of going towards Endpoint Manager, you really do start to unlock some real cool potential as part of that adoption process as well, right? So to kind of tie things back to where we were, obviously, thank you very much for your time today. If you guys wanted to talk about or get in touch about anything, there's some information on the screen now. Please get in touch through the website. There's a telephone number on there as well if you feel old school. There's your account manager at PowerON as well as anyone else from the team, either through social media, LinkedIn, and so on as well. So thank you very much for your time and have a good day.